Late Tuesday night in mid-November, the air was biting and cold. High above the bustling streets of Upper Manhattan, on a flat roof 60 feet over the hard pavement, Bumpy Johnson found himself trapped. 12 thugs stood in a half-moon shape, pinning him against the ledge. These men weren't carrying pistols, they held heavy wooden clubs, metal pipes, and thick wrenches. They didn't want a fast ending. They wanted to hear bones snap and watch a proud man crawl. This crew called themselves the River Street Crew, a nasty mix of street fighters from the docks. Their boss was a big, mean guy named Mickey, the Ghost, Sullivan. Mickey was a powerhouse with a pale face and a temper that scared his own shadow. Usually, Mickey stayed in his own neighborhood near the shipyards, far away from Bumpy's kingdom. But tonight, he was far from home, looking to start a war. The trouble kicked off a month ago over a small-time hustler named Leo. Leo worked for Bumpy, taking bets in the gray area between the two gang territories. For a long time, everyone got along fine. Then, Mickey got greedy. He sent a message to Leo, "Pay the River Street Crew or get buried." Leo did the right thing and told Bumpy. Bumpy, wanting to keep things smooth and professional, sent a trusted friend to talk to Mickey. The deal was simple. The neighborhood stayed open for everyone. Bumpy wasn't looking for a fight, just fairness. Mickey didn't care for fairness. He chose violence instead. A few days later, Leo was found dumped behind a grocery store. He was alive, but barely. His limbs were shattered, and he was beaten so badly his own mother wouldn't have known him. It was a loud, bloody declaration of war. Bumpy didn't panic. He played it smart. He sent a few of his best guys down to the docks on a Friday night. They caught 2 of Mickey's collectors coming out of a local pub and gave them the exact same treatment Leo got. It was an even trade. An eye for an eye. Bumpy was showing them that for every blow they landed, he would land one right back. That should have been the end of it. Both sides had bled, a point had been made, and it was time to get back to business. But Mickey, the Ghost, Sullivan wasn't built for logic. To him, this wasn't business anymore, it was a personal insult. He couldn't stomach the idea of Bumpy Johnson standing up to him. Mickey didn't want a truce. He wanted Bumpy gone. He figured if he cut off the head of the snake, the rest of the neighborhood would crumble, making it easy for his crew to swoop in and take over every street corner. Mickey set a trap. He called for a peace summit on a chilly Tuesday night at an old, half-empty tenement building on the edge of the district. The bottom floor was a boarded-up deli, and the top floors were mostly storage. The building's owner was deep in debt to Mickey, so he handed over the keys and looked the other way. Bumpy pulled up a few minutes past the agreed time. He did it on purpose, a small power move to show he set the pace. Following the rules of a neutral meeting, he arrived by himself, showing he was a man of his word. Instead of walking through the front door, he took the rusty metal stairs up the side of the building to the roof, keeping things low-key. When he stepped onto the gravel rooftop, he saw Mickey waiting. But Mickey wasn't alone. 12 other goons stepped out of the shadows, surrounding Bumpy in a tight circle of steel and wood. Bumpy's eyes scanned the crowd. He realized instantly that there was no deal to be made. This was an ambush. "Glad you could join us, Bumpy," Mickey said, his voice smooth and cold. "We need to talk about my boys at the docks. We need to talk about who really runs things around here. It's all about respect." Bumpy didn't flinch. He looked at the 13 armed men and the 4-story drop behind him. He knew the fire escape was blocked. He was a great fighter, but even he couldn't take down a small army with his bare hands. He knew his right-hand man Marcus was waiting for a phone call, but that call wasn't due for another hour. He was truly on his own. "Respect?" Bumpy asked, his voice steady as a rock. He showed no terror, even though he knew he was standing on the edge of his own grave. That's a funny word coming from a man who hides behind a dozen guys just to have a conversation. Mickey smirked, stepping closer. "Negotiations are for people on the same level. And from where I'm standing, you're already beneath me. You're just a small-time boss holding onto a neighborhood that's outgrown you," Mickey sneered. pulling a heavy black handgun from his coat. He didn't aim to fire, he waved it around like a conductor's baton, using the cold steel to punctuate his threats. "I'm growing my business, and you're standing right in the middle of my new storefront. It's just math, Bumpy. I'm clearing the floor." The circle tightened. Bumpy's eyes darted, cataloging the danger with clinical precision. 3 guys to his left gripped heavy ash bats. To his right, 2 more held jagged crowbars. Behind him, a man balanced a heavy tire iron in his palm. They were perfectly spaced, blocking every possible exit. Mickey had clearly done this many times before, cornering a target, making them feel small before the end. "Here's the play-by-play," Mickey continued, savoring the moment. "My crew is going to take turns breaking every bone you've got. We're going to ruin that suit and that face until there's nothing left to recognize. And then, we're going to toss you over the ledge. It's a 60-foot drop to the pavement. If the fall doesn't kill you, being a paralyzed shell of a man will. You can't rule the streets from a wheelchair." Bumpy processed the math of the situation. Option A: fight back, get beaten for 20 minutes, and then get thrown off. Option B: stand still, get beaten for 20 minutes, and then get thrown off. The pain was the only variable. He saw no reason to give them the satisfaction of a long, drawn-out torture session. He decided to break their rhythm. "Then quit flapping your gums and get to it," Bumpy said, his voice cutting through the wind. "You've got all these men and all these tools. If you're going to kill me, do it. Or are you too scared to move without a script?" Instead of backing away from the ledge, Bumpy walked right toward it. He was taking the lead in his own execution, refusing to play the victim. He stole Mickey's momentum, forcing the gang leader to react to him rather than the other way around. Mickey's smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine anger. He expected Bumpy to beg for his life or offer him money. He didn't expect the man to walk toward his own death with a shrug. "You want it fast? Fine," Mickey snapped, waving his hand at his muscle. "Don't waste time with the clubs. Just throw him over right now." 4 of the biggest men lunged at once. They lunged for Bumpy's collar, his sleeves, and his waist, using their combined weight to pin him and lift him toward the empty air beyond the ledge. The goons dragged him to the crumbling brick ledge that rimmed the roof. Below them, the avenue stretched out, dotted with a few late-night walkers heading toward jazz clubs and diners. It was a typical evening in the city, but that was about to change. Bumpy didn't fight them. He knew that struggling would only lead to a brutal pre-fall beating. He wanted to keep his mind clear and his eyes open. He needed to be awake to have any hope of surviving the drop. 60 feet is a long way down, but it isn't always a death sentence if a man knows how to land. He prayed for a bit of luck as they gripped his limbs, swung him back to gain momentum, and launched him into the dark air. It was exactly 8:47 p.m. when Bumpy left the edge of the building. As he plummeted, gravity took hold, pulling him toward the concrete at a terrifying speed. He had less than 2 seconds of airtime. In those heart-pounding moments, his survival instincts and years of street training kicked in. He knew the golden rule of a fall: protect the vitals. He tucked his chin, pulled his arms tight against his chest, and twisted his body. He aimed to hit with his legs first. A shattered leg can be set in a cast. A shattered skull is the end of the story. He slammed into the pavement 2 seconds later. He hit with his left leg first, the force then rolling through his hip and shoulder. By spreading the impact across his side rather than hitting flat, he let physics save his life. His left thigh bone snapped with a sickening pop, his hip popped out of its socket, and his shoulder was badly mangled. The pain was a white-hot explosion that threatened to black him out, but his head remained clear. His spine was whole. He was alive. Witnesses on the street began to scream. Some people scrambled toward him, while others fled in terror, unsure if they were looking at a suicide or a murder attempt. Someone sprinted to a nearby shop to call for an ambulance, shouting that a man had just fallen from the sky. Up on the roof, Mickey and his crew peered over the ledge. They saw Bumpy's twisted body lying still on the cold ground. To them, he looked like a discarded rag doll. Satisfied that their problem was solved, they hurried down the back stairs, piled into their getaway cars, and sped back toward the safety of the docks to celebrate. They thought they had just opened the door to take over the whole city. On the sidewalk, Bumpy lay in the dark, gasping for air. He tried to move, but his left leg was useless. He was broken, but he wasn't finished. His left hip was out of its socket, making standing impossible. His left shoulder was a wreck, but his right side still had some fight in it. Using his good arm and leg, he began to claw at the pavement, dragging his broken frame inch by inch. A small crowd of onlookers stood frozen in shock. Bumpy knew the clock was ticking. In this neighborhood, a man falling from a building would bring sirens and flashing lights within minutes. If the police found him, he'd be hauled to a hospital bed, pinned down by paperwork and guarded by cops. He would be a sitting duck for Mickey's crew to come back and finish the job. A woman in her 40s, a local who recognized his face immediately, stepped forward. "Mr. Johnson, you're hurt bad," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I need to call an ambulance." "No doctors," Bumpy gasped, the pain turning his voice into a gravelly rasp. "No cops. Just get me into that shadows, the alleyway, please." With his right arm hooked over her shoulder and his good leg pushing off the concrete, they began a grueling trek. It was only 10 feet to the darkness of the alley, but it felt like a mile. Every movement felt like a hot knife twisting in his joints. They reached the cover of the brick walls just as the first wail of a police siren echoed in the distance. The police arrived 4 minutes later, typical for the area. They found a confused crowd and a few bloodstains on the sidewalk, but no victim. To the officers, it was just another weird city mystery they wouldn't bother solving. Hidden in the gloom, Bumpy leaned against a trash bin and looked at the woman. He rattled off a phone number from memory. "Call Marcus," he told her. "Tell him I'm in the gap behind the old deli. Tell him it was Mickey, the ghost. Tell him to bring the whole family and every piece of steel we own. Tell him we move in 2 hours. Go." The woman didn't hesitate. She ran to a nearby corner store and dropped a coin in the slot. On the other end, Marcus picked up. He didn't need a long explanation. The mention of Mickey and the 2-hour window told him everything. The boss was down, the enemy was marked, and it was time for war. Marcus hung up and started dialing. All over the neighborhood, phones began to ring. Men stopped what they were doing, reached for hidden floorboards, and checked their magazines. In the alley, Bumpy sat in the dark, clutching his mangled arm. He looked at his watch. The countdown had started. 2 hours until the biggest shootout the city had ever seen. The officers at the scene got nowhere. The stories they heard were a mess of contradictions. Different heights, different ages, different descriptions of what had even fallen. In a neighborhood with bigger fish to fry, the police eventually just shrugged it off as a ghost story or a jumper who got lucky and ran off. They closed their notebooks and rolled out, leaving the alley in silence. Inside the shadows, Bumpy fought to stay awake. Every breath was a battle against the agony in his hip and the burning in his shoulder. He knew that if he closed his eyes, he might never open them again. He used the pain, turning it into a cold, hard focus. He wasn't just a man anymore, he was a countdown. At 9:15 p.m., a dark sedan eased into the mouth of the alley. Marcus stepped out with 3 heavy hitters. When he saw Bumpy slumped against the brick, his face went pale. "Boss, we have to get you to a surgeon. Now." "No," Bumpy rasped, his voice vibrating with a terrifying kind of calm. "Doctors can wait. Mickey Sullivan cannot. How many soldiers can you pull together in an hour?" The anger was working better than any painkiller. Mickey had thought he was tossing out the trash. Instead, he had just lit a fuse that was going to blow his entire world apart. Bumpy didn't want a message sent back. He wanted the River Street crew wiped off the map. "I can get 30 guys in 60 minutes, Marcus replied, his mind racing through the roster. "If you give me 90 minutes, I can get 35, maybe 40. On a Saturday night, some guys are out at the clubs, but they'll drop everything for this." "Take the 90 minutes, Bumpy commanded. I need the time to keep my head straight anyway. Bumpy laid out the details of the trap on the roof. He described the 13 men, the way they threw him, and the look on Mickey's face. He wanted Marcus to understand that this wasn't just a business dispute anymore. Mickey thinks I'm a corpse on the sidewalk, Bumpy said. He thinks he's won. He's going to be celebrating at his bars and his betting parlors. We are going to hit every single spot the River Street crew touches. Every clubhouse, every dockside pub, every basement game. If they work for Mickey, they don't see the sun come up. No survivors. No mercy. By tomorrow morning, that crew doesn't exist. Marcus went quiet. He knew this wasn't a standard hit, it was a massacre. Boss, a move that big, it's going to bring every cop in the city down on us. A hit that big will bring the feds. It'll be front-page news across the country, Marcus warned, his voice low. Let them print it, Bumpy countered. This is about making sure every person in the city knows the cost of coming after me. Mickey Sullivan thought he could gamble with my life. He lost. Tonight, he pays the debt. His crew, his business, his name, it all gets buried. I want it scrubbed clean. There was no room for negotiation. Bumpy's eyes were like flint. Marcus nodded, seeing the fire in his boss's eyes. He wasn't just surviving. He was becoming a force of nature. 90 minutes, Marcus promised. I'll have 40 men and enough lead to sink a battleship. I'll get Doc Harris over here first to patch you up enough to move. Doc Harris had been a medic in the Great War. He didn't have a fancy office, but he knew how to fix a man under fire. He arrived 20 minutes later, his kit rattling in the dark alley. The process was brutal. He had to reset Bumpy's hip, a sound of bone sliding into place that would have made a lesser man faint. Bumpy didn't make a sound. He just gritted his teeth until they nearly cracked, turning that agony into a cold, hard resolve. Doc strapped the shoulder tight and put a temporary splint on the broken leg. He offered a bottle of heavy painkillers, but Bumpy pushed them away. He didn't want a fog in his brain. He wanted the sharp, stinging clarity of his own fury. By 10:15 p.m., the neighborhood had answered the call. 37 soldiers stood ready in a hidden garage near the edge of the district. The word had traveled like a lightning strike. Mickey's crew had tried to murder the king of Harlem. This wasn't just a job anymore, it was a matter of pride for every man in the room. The firepower laid out on the workbenches was staggering. They had nearly 30 handguns, a dozen heavy-duty shotguns, and 7 street sweepers, fast-firing submachine guns meant for clearing rooms. They had enough crates of ammo to fight a small war. Bumpy looked over his army. He was battered, broken, and leaned heavily on a makeshift cane, but he looked more dangerous than ever. This wasn't going to be a series of quiet hits. This was going to be an invasion. This was more than a retaliation, it was an all-out invasion. Bumpy sat in the back of a sedan, his broken body propped up, his mind sharp as a razor. He split his army into 5 strike teams, 7 soldiers deep, with 2 extra units floating for backup. Each group had a specific destination in the Docks District. Target 1, the Rusty Anchor, on 10th and 47th. This was Mickey's throne room, where the River Street crew did their planning, and where Mickey, the Ghost, Sullivan was currently holding court. Target 2, the Iron Works Gym, on 9th and 44th. Their training ground and primary weapons locker. Target 3, the Ace of Spades, on 11th and 52nd. The illegal casino where they laundered their dirty cash. Target 4, Gully's Auto Body, on 10th and 41st. Where they stashed their getaway cars and hijacked cargo. Target 5, the Pier Side Lounge, on 9th and 50th. A secondary hangout where Mickey's top lieutenants gathered to drink. The plan was surgical. All 5 teams would strike at exactly 10:45 p.m. to paralyze Mickey's ability to respond. Bumpy couldn't charge in on his feet, but his presence was felt in every car. Marcus drove him to a tactical vantage point on 10th Avenue where he could oversee 3 of the locations. From the shadows of the back seat, Bumpy was the general, coordinating the chaos through radio signals and sheer force of will. By 10:44 p.m., the hunters were in place. Through the windows of the rusty anchor, Mickey could be seen laughing with a drink in his hand, surrounded by a dozen of his best men. At the gym, 8 thugs were working the bags. The gambling den was packed with 15 people counting chips. All in all, nearly 50 members of the River Street crew were in the crosshairs, every single one of them guilty by association for the attempt on Bumpy's life. Bumpy looked at his watch. 10:44 and 47 seconds p.m. 13 seconds remained until the silence of the city was shattered by the heaviest coordinated strike in the history of the streets. 13 seconds to go. Mickey Sullivan and his River Street crew were about to discover that trying to kill Bumpy Johnson didn't solve their problem. It turned the entire neighborhood into a weapon pointed directly at their hearts. At 10:45 p.m. sharp, the city exploded. Across 5 different blocks, 35 men opened fire at the exact same moment. The timing was perfect, every watch was synced, and every man knew his role. No warnings were given. No mercy was shown. Target 1. The rusty anchor. Team 1 was led by Ray, a 32-year-old veteran who had seen the worst of the front lines in Korea. He knew how to clear a room. Inside the pub, Mickey Sullivan was leaning back in a booth, a glass of top-shelf whiskey in his hand, laughing about the man he thought he'd left for dead on the pavement. Ray didn't knock. He kicked the front door so hard the frames splintered into toothpicks. Before the door even hit the floor, Ray was inside with his Thompson submachine gun leveled. The first burst of lead caught Mickey right in the chest. His drink shattered, and he tumbled backward, dead before his head hit the wall. The other 11 thugs scrambled for their guns, but they were already too late. Ray's team poured in like a flood. They fired in disciplined, 3-round bursts, quiet, professional, and lethal. Shotguns roared, covering the corners so no one could hide. In just 45 seconds, the throne room was silent. 12 men were down. Team 1 vanished out the back door and into their getaway car before the first 911 call was even placed. Target 2. The Iron Works Gym. 2 blocks away, Team 2 was moving in. They were led by Tom, a 28-year-old former Marine who had survived the mud and blood of the Pacific Islands. He was a man who moved with terrifying speed. The gym was a big, echoing space filled with the sound of punching bags and heavy breathing. 8 of Mickey's recruits were inside, working on their footwork and muscle, thinking they were becoming tough guys. At 10:45 p.m., their training session ended permanently. Tom's team didn't just walk in, they took the building apart. The large glass windows at the front were blown inward by a barrage of buckshot. The thugs inside, caught in their gym clothes and without their weapons within reach, had nowhere to go. The boxing ring became a trap. Tom moved through the space with the cold efficiency of a hunter, ensuring that by 10:46 p.m., there wasn't a single member of the River Street crew left standing in that gym. Bumpy sat in the car a few blocks away, listening to the distant pops and booms echoing through the canyons of the city. He didn't smile. He just checked his watch. 2 targets down. 3 to go. Tom wasn't interested in a fair fight, he wanted chaos. Instead of a standard breach, he used a more primitive and terrifying method. 4 glass bottles filled with gasoline and stuffed with rags. At precisely 10:45 p.m., the front windows of the Iron Works gym shattered as the firebombs tumbled inside. Liquid fire splashed across the mats and wooden floors, turning the training area into a furnace in seconds. The 8 thugs inside were blinded by smoke and gripped by a primal terror of the heat. They scrambled for the doors, desperate for air, only to find that every exit was a trap. As they stumbled out into the night, coughing and covered in soot, they were met with a wall of lead. Tom's team was waiting in the shadows. All 8 targets were dropped on the sidewalk. By the time the fire engines were screaming toward the block, Tom and his men had already melted into the city streets, leaving nothing but a burning building and 8 lifeless bodies. Target 3, the Ace of Spades. Down on 11th Avenue, Team 3 was moving on the gambling den. Their leader was James, a 35-year-old who had never worn a military uniform but had spent 12 years as Bumpy's top street enforcer. He knew the geography of a basement fight. The casino was underground, accessible only by a single narrow staircase, a classic bottleneck that should have favored the guys inside. James turned that advantage on its head. He left 2 men at the top of the stairs with heavy shotguns, their orders simple: no one gets out. At 10:44 and 45 seconds p.m., 15 seconds early to catch them completely off guard, James and the other 4 men charged down the steps. Inside, 15 of the River Street crew were surrounded by the sounds of clinking chips and sliding cards. They were busy counting their winnings and drinking beer when the basement became a slaughterhouse. James didn't waste breath on a warning. His team opened up with everything they had. The heavy poker tables offered no protection against the high-caliber rounds ripping through the room. Cash and cards flew through the air, stained red. Because of the number of targets and the cramped space, the engagement lasted 90 seconds, longer than the others, as James's team moved methodically through the room to ensure no one was playing dead. 15 men went down. None got back up. Team 3 walked back up the stairs, stepped over the threshold, and vanished into the darkness of the industrial district. Target 4, Gully's Auto Body. Team 4 was led by Bill, a 41-year-old former mechanic who had run a legitimate shop until he partnered with Bumpy 5 years ago. He knew exactly how garages were built, and how to tear them down. This facility was a chop shop where Mickey's crew stripped stolen cars and swapped VIN plates. Through the office windows, 4 thugs could be seen working under flashlights on a high-end sedan. Bill's approach was surgical. At 10:44 p.m., 2 of his men cut the main power lines to the building. The sudden darkness plunged the shop into a state of confusion. At 10:45 p.m. sharp, Bill's team breached the side entrance. The 4 targets were caught off guard, their hands still covered in grease as they reached for weapons they couldn't find in the dark. The engagement lasted only 20 seconds. All 4 were eliminated with professional precision. But Bill wasn't done. Following Bumpy's orders to erase the legacy, they doused the inventory and the specialized tools in gasoline. As they retreated, they tossed a match. The resulting inferno didn't just burn the building, it vaporized every asset Mickey had stored there. Target 5, the Pier Side Lounge. The final strike fell on a gritty bar on 9th Avenue. Team 5 was headed by Bobby, a former light heavyweight boxer with 12 pro wins. He was a man of few words and immense violence. While the front of the lounge was filled with ordinary neighborhood drinkers, the backroom was the nerve center where Mickey's lieutenants gathered. 10 high-ranking members of the River Street crew were huddled around a table in that backroom. They were busy toastings to their new territory in Harlem and dividing up the expected profits. They were so distracted by their own greed that they didn't notice the 7 men in long coats walking calmly through the front bar. Bobby's team ignored the civilians at the counter. They weren't there for the innocent, they were there for the cancer in the back. Bobby reached the rear door, turned the handle, and stepped inside. For a split second, the 10 lieutenants looked up, their expressions shifting from annoyance to pure, cold realization. Recognition hit them, but it came far too late. Bobby's unit filled the entrance, creating a wall of steel that blocked the only way out. The room was small, and the fire was concentrated. For 30 seconds, the air was filled with the roar of lead and the smell of gunpowder. 10 men were trapped in that confined space. None of them survived the first minute. The team backed out through the rear alley and disappeared into their waiting sedan. The regular patrons in the front bar were left shaking and terrified, but they weren't the targets. They had seen 7 men in dark coats, and that was as much as the police would ever get out of them. The entire operation, the dismantling of an entire criminal empire, took exactly 4 minutes. From 10:45 p.m. to 10:49 p.m., the River Street crew was erased from existence. Mickey Sullivan was gone. His 12 top guys at the pub were gone. The 8 trainees at the gym, the 15 gamblers at the casino, the 4 mechanics at the shop, and the 10 lieutenants at the lounge, all dead. 49 casualties. 0 survivors. From the moment Bumpy hit the sidewalk to the moment his enemies breathed their last, only 2 hours had passed. The sound was a thunderclap that rolled across dozens of city blocks. With 5 locations exploding at once, the police dispatchers were overwhelmed. Calls were flooding in from every direction. A shooting here, a massive fire there, a massacre down the street. It wasn't a gang fight, It was an urban war. The first patrol cars screeched to a halt at the Rusty Anchor at 10:51 p.m. They were only 6 minutes late to the start, but they were 2 minutes too late to find anyone alive. Inside, it was a scene of total devastation, blood, spent shells, and broken dreams of expansion. By 11:15 p.m., the docks were crawling with every detective, captain, and commissioner in the city. They stood in shock, staring at the sheer scale of the professional execution. 5 targets hit at the exact same second, 49 dead, and not a single shooter in sight. It was a message written in blood that would be felt by every organization in the country. Bumpy Johnson sat in the shadows of the car on 10th Avenue, watching the blue and red lights flash against the brick walls. His leg was shattered and his hip was screaming in agony, but a cold sense of peace settled over him. He had been thrown from a roof and left for dead, and 2 hours later, he had finished a war. He was still the king, and the city knew it. The mission was a total success. Every strike team checked in, confirming that all targets were neutralized and all men were accounted for. Bumpy's side hadn't lost a single soldier. On the other side, 49 men were gone. It was a brutal piece of math. Mickey Sullivan tried to take Bumpy's life, so Bumpy took Mickey's entire world. The scales were balanced. The war was over because one side no longer existed. Marcus drove the car north, leaving the sirens and the smoke of the docks behind. They moved at the speed limit, blending in with the Saturday night traffic, looking like any other car heading home. Inside, the adrenaline that had kept Bumpy upright was finally drying up. The agony in his leg turned into a heavy, rhythmic throb, and his hip felt like it was being scorched by a blowtorch. With the job done, his body was finally demanding payment for the fall. They pulled up to the docks clinic at 11:47 p.m. Doc Harris was ready for them. He had the lights dimmed and his tools sterilized. The exam took half an hour. The x-rays showed the thigh bone was snapped clean, no jagged shards, which was a lucky break in an unlucky situation. He'd need a heavy cast and 3 months before he could walk without a cane. The hip was already back in place, and the shoulder just needed to be bound tight and kept still. This time, Bumpy didn't refuse the painkillers. Once he was patched up, Marcus moved him to a secret spot in another borough. It wasn't Bumpy's usual home or any place the law knew about. It was a quiet house bought under a ghost name, tucked away where no one would look. Marcus set up a heavy guard detail, 12 of their best men rotating in shifts around the clock. No one was getting in, and no one was going to finish what Mickey started. By Sunday morning, the news hit the stands like a physical blow. The tabloids screamed about the Docks District massacre, filling the front pages with photos of body bags and shattered storefronts. They called it the bloodiest night in the city's history. The bigger papers were more clinical, calling it an unprecedented act of coordinated violence that changed the map of the underworld forever. In the neighborhood papers, the story was told differently. They wrote about a leader who had been attacked and had stood his ground. They didn't have to name Bumpy to let everyone know who was still in charge. Mickey, the Ghost, Sullivan was the lead name on the casualty list, a man who thought he could expand his territory and ended up losing everything in exactly 2 hours. The newspapers painted a picture of a criminal empire dismantled with surgical accuracy. The reports marveled at the military-style coordination, noting that hitting 5 spots at once required a level of planning rarely seen in the underworld. While the papers hinted at a revenge plot or a border war, no one could officially link the name Bumpy Johnson to the carnage. There were no snitches, no slips, and no loose ends. The police response was massive. They locked down the docks, bagged 49 bodies, and swept up hundreds of brass shells. They knew the types of guns used, heavy submachine guns and tactical shotguns, but the weapons themselves had vanished into the city. In the early 1950s, without the help of modern DNA or advanced tracking, the detectives were chasing ghosts. A special team of 20 top investigators was put on the case, and even the federal boys in suits started poking around. They were looking for an army, but all they found was a wall of silence. They talked to nearly 1,000 people across the city, from barmaids to dockworkers. Every single person had the same story. They didn't see a thing, they didn't hear a thing, and they didn't know a soul involved. It wasn't just loyalty, It was the kind of fear that keeps a neighborhood quiet. The task force stayed on the job for half a year, filling cabinets with thousands of pages of notes and reports. They followed every trail and checked every lead, but at the end of 6 months, they had exactly 0 arrests. Not a single person was ever charged for the events of that night. On the books, it was the greatest unsolved mass murder in the city's history. But in the streets, the case was closed. The River Street crew didn't just lose a battle, they were wiped from the history books. Mickey, the ghost, Sullivan was gone, and every man who took orders from him was in a box. His garages were ash, his casinos were empty, and his name was a warning. Other crews eventually moved in to take over the docks. Italian outfits and other local gangs split up the scraps Mickey left behind. The map of the city shifted, and new faces appeared on the corners. But one thing stayed the same: no one ever looked north toward Harlem with greed in their eyes again. The lesson of that Saturday night was carved into the pavement. Everyone knew the price of trying to break Bumpy Johnson, and nobody was willing to pay it twice. The outcome of that night was total and absolute. The story didn't stay in the newspapers for long, but it became a permanent fixture in the whispers of the underworld. It turned into a legend passed between bosses and street soldiers alike, a cautionary tale about the man who fell from the sky and returned as a storm. Everyone knew the details. Bumpy Johnson was tossed off a 60-foot ledge by a crew from the docks, survived the concrete, and erased every single one of his attackers before the blood on the sidewalk had even dried. The feat was viewed as a masterclass in strategy. It proved that Bumpy wasn't just a leader because of his muscle, but because of a terrifying, unbreakable will. Even while broken and bleeding, he had orchestrated a 5-point invasion of enemy territory in less than 120 minutes. By the time the winter winds of December arrived, Bumpy made his public return. He walked with a slight limp and leaned on a polished wooden cane, but he was visible and standing tall. When he stepped into his favorite neighborhood jazz club and took his usual seat, the room went silent in respect. He didn't have to say a word. His presence alone announced that the King of Harlem was back, and the throne was still his. The message was received by every rival in the city: if you strike at the king, you had better not miss, because there is no hiding from the retaliation. The physical toll of the fall stayed with him. On freezing nights, his hip would burn, and his shoulder would grow stiff. But he didn't view these as weaknesses. To Bumpy, those aches were medals of honor, proof that he could be battered but never truly broken. He was a man who had survived the impossible, and responded with a vengeance that reset the rules of the street. As for Mickey, the ghost, Sullivan, his end was as quiet as his life was loud. The authorities held his remains for half a year as part of their stalled investigation. When the body was finally released, there was no grand send-off. His family held a tiny, husied funeral in a quiet cemetery far from the city. There were no lieutenants left to carry his casket and no empire left to mourn him. He was just another name in the ground, a reminder of what happens when you try to push Bumpy Johnson off his ledge. A lonely plot in Cedar Grove Cemetery holds what's left of the man who thought he could take over the city. The headstone is plain and cheap, offering no clues about his violent end or the 48 men who fell with him. It simply reads, Mickey Sullivan, 1918 to 1952. At 34 years old, he had tried to erase a legend and ended up becoming a ghost himself. The River Street crew name vanished from the docks almost overnight. No one dared to use it, and no one claimed they had ever been a part of it. It wasn't just a defeat, it was a total scrubbing of their existence from the history of the streets. New crews eventually took over the piers with different names and different bosses, but they all operated with a newfound sense of boundaries. They knew where the city ended and where Bumpy's kingdom began. 16 years later, in the summer of 1968, a daring reporter for a city magazine dug up the old files. He spent months looking into what the locals still called the Night of the Docks. His finished piece was a deep dive into the 5 simultaneous attacks that had claimed 49 lives in under 5 minutes. For the first time in print, the journalist connected the dots. He wrote about a man being tossed from a tenement roof in Upper Manhattan and the bloodbath that followed exactly 2 hours later. He named Bumpy Johnson as the central figure. While he didn't have the smoking gun or a witness willing to sign an affidavit, the implication was loud and clear. It was a story of a man who refused to die and a crew that paid for that mistake with their lives. The article ended with a haunting reminder of how the streets really work. The Great Massacre of 1952 remains officially cold. 49 lives were taken, and the law never found a single killer. But in the neighborhood where it happened, everyone knows that justice wasn't found in a courtroom, it was delivered on the pavement. Bumpy Johnson had the last word, not just that night, but for decades to follow. He proved that some men are too heavy to be thrown away. In the shadows of the city, the truth was never a mystery. The streets don't need a judge to tell them what happened when the evidence is written in the morgue records. The rules are carved into the very brick and mortar of the neighborhood. If you strike at Harlem, you face the end of your world. If you strike at Bumpy Johnson, you face total erasure. The numbers tell the story better than any witness ever could. It is a timeline of absolute power and terrifying speed. 8:47 p.m. Bumpy Johnson is launched from a 60-foot ledge by 13 thugs. 8:47 and 2 seconds p.m. He slams into the pavement, broken but breathing. 9:15 p.m. The call goes out, the family mobilizes. 10:15 p.m. Nearly 40 soldiers are armed to the teeth and ready to march. 10:45 p.m. The first shots ring out across 5 different blocks. 10:49 p.m. The guns go silent. The River Street crew is gone. 11 p.m. The police arrive at a graveyard of their own making. In just 120 minutes, the world shifted. It took 2 hours to go from a desperate fall for survival to the systematic destruction of an entire criminal empire. This wasn't a simple act of getting even, it was a demonstration of why Bumpy Johnson held the crown. He proved that survival is only the first step. True power is the ability to strike back with a force so final that there is no one left to tell the other side of the story. Mickey, the ghost, Sullivan bet everything on the idea that Bumpy was just a man who could be tossed aside like trash. He was wrong. He died, his legacy burned, and 48 of his men followed him into the dirt. 4 minutes of gunfire corrected a 2-hour mistake, leaving behind a lesson that would haunt the city for decades. Some men are simply too dangerous to touch. If you enjoyed this story, please drop a comment below and let us know your favorite part. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a new episode of Street History. Your support keeps these stories alive.